Hello everyone and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in to today's show, and it should be a good one as always. We'll be talking about Thursday Night Football one day in advance. We'll be talking about it from a general betting perspective. Then I'm going to give you some popular prop bets that might be able to hit for you tomorrow night. I'm going to conclude my positional rankings, my weekly positional rankings with the tight ends and defenses and special teams units that I think will define the fantasy football weekend. And speaking of defining the fantasy football weekend, I give my weekly shadow report in my final segment, the key wide receiver cornerback matchups that you're going to have to determine in terms of winning the week from a fantasy perspective. But before we get into any of that, I do want to remind you that if you want more content such as this or other podcasts to enjoy here on the network, consider liking, following, and subscribing to both the show and the network. But if you want to interact with this particular podcast or others on a more direct level, make use of the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features. The best way to do it. You can do one of two things. You can either click the $ in the comment section, leave a tip or donation, or you can also make yourselves available to just commenting, whether it be questions, comments, or concerns throughout the show itself. And that's a great way to contribute and interact with the show and make it that much better. But without further ado, let us jump into today's show. And let's start off talking about tomorrow night's game between the Texans and the Jets here. Thursday Night Football should be a very interesting game. Now, before we get into the whole outlook of this game, let me get into the betting perspective here. And the New York Jets, a surprising 2-point favorite in this one, the over-under being 42.5. Houston minus 110, New York Jets minus 110. So pretty even money lines there. But let's get into why it feels like the Jets can be favored in this game and why people are going to tend to bet more on them in this game than the Texans. Obviously, the number one reason is the fact that Stephon Diggs will not play in this game. In fact, he will not play for the rest of the season with a torn ACL, and thus that eliminates one more receiver from that Texans wide receiver room. Now it's just down to Tank Dell, Robert Woods, and rookie Xavier Hutchinson. So that does not necessarily look like a wide receiver core with much promise headed into this game against a vaunted Jets defense. However, the reason why I feel like the Texans are in this game is because they're the team that feels like it has an identity no matter who is playing for them. Whereas the Jets, I have no sympathy for whether they're favored or not. And it's a harsh reality for Jets and especially for Jets fans watching this show to hear, but I'm just telling it like it is. This is a team that is not run like a team. This is more of an organization who is willing to fill the needs of certain players to satisfy them at the risk of underperforming or not performing up to their standards. Whereas the Texans, nobody really expected them to look this good over the past 2 years, what with the new head coach, the new quarterback last year in Stroud, and to be at this point where they're now expected to beat inferior teams and cement themselves as someone who can contend in not just the AFC, but in the Super Bowl race as well. So that is why I feel like you can never count out the Texans, no matter how dire the situation. But when I look at this game, and I see it in terms of what the future could hold, win or lose for both of these teams, it certainly feels like the Texans have more of a point to prove than the Jets, because we now know the Jets' struggles. We don't necessarily know how the Texans, especially in a much weirder 6-2 start than a lot of people would have expected for them going forward. So this game certainly feels like it should be a must-win for the Jets, but it's also a must-win for the Texans because their schedule is deceivingly tough down the stretch. There are some winnable games in there, but there are some very tough games mixed in as well. If I pull up their schedule here to talk about, there definitely are some pratfalls they could fall into, because after this game they play the Lions, the Cowboys, they play the Titans twice, they have the Jaguars and Dolphins mixed in as well, and then they end the season with the Chiefs, the Ravens, and the Titans again. So there are going to be some difficult stretches for the Texans this season. It's not going to be all sunshine and rainbows. So this game certainly needs to be a game they feel they can win to kind of have them going in the right direction. Because this season has not felt like a 6-2 season, if you know what I mean, for the Texans. It's felt like a season where luck plays a huge factor into the outcome of Texans games, where you gotta love the fact that they have the ability to come back against certain teams, but you don't necessarily want that to be something you have to rely upon week in, week out. You need games where you can take care of business as quickly as possible. This feels like one, but now it just got a lot harder, what with the fact that Stephon Diggs is no longer catching balls for you this season. And so that's why I feel like a lot of bettors are hopeful and optimistic the Jets can prove them right for at least one of these games, because now on paper they're the more talented team. And so Vegas is quick to believe that talent can equate to success in games such as this, where one team has the superior feel to it, has the superior identity, but the other has an assortment of players that, when they're on their game, can, at the end of the day, steal some wins. And that's what the Jets certainly feel like in certain moments. But the reason why I'm not as sympathetic about them as, say, other teams who could have been in the same situation is because of the fact that it's not a team anymore. This is an assortment of guys who can't decide how they want to play or understand how to operate together as one collective. There's a difference between the Jets' organizational hierarchy and the actual team structure that is leading to a disconnect on the field. And until they figure some modicum or iota of success out, then this team, even in games where you feel like they can be in it, won't necessarily translate onto the field. And so that's why I feel like the Texans should not be underestimated in this game in the slightest, because they have that identity, no matter how rough it's looked this season, how shaky that identity has proven to be. I still think, they have a better formula to account for certain things than the Jets do to try and figure out the mess they're in. So that's why, me personally, I still will pick the Texans in this game. However, there's something to be said about this spread where it's not like the Jets are favored by that much. The line only moved by 1 point over the past couple of days since I've written this down. So, as you can see, there are ways in which you can justify the Jets, because it's not necessarily sweat off your back if, say, this is a 3 to 5 point game, because you can tell that this money line, this over-under, this spread in particular can certainly hit. It's just a matter of, actual talent equating to actual success is my issue here. Because I want to like the Jets in games such as this, where they seemingly have the advantage. But you have to think about certain ways that they can shoot themselves in the foot, because they always find different ways to. And until they prove that they can overcome those odds and actually find some moments of success and be able to sustain that success through certain games, then I'm sitting here telling you that you shouldn't bet for them, because of the fact that even though there will be games in the future where it'll be tough to ignore them going up against certain teams. Even if those teams aren't as depleted as the Texans are now, I will still say be cautionary about betting for the Jets or betting on the Jets, because they're just such a fickle team that I don't even know can be described as a team right now, considering the state of that entire organization and considering the direction they seem to be heading. There is no sense of upside to this Jets team right now, and until they prove me wrong on a football field, I don't necessarily know how these players, no matter how talented they are, can prove that they can play as a collective instead of, create a certain tension around this team that's been there since day one. And I feel like, yes, I could look pretty foolish come Friday for making this prediction just because of the fact, the Jets can at any certain moment turn the Jets on. No pun intended, but I feel like this isn't the time. I feel like the Texans are a team that by hook or by crook seemingly find their identity in certain situations. Even when they're down and out, they always come back to this collective whole that can win football games in many different ways. It hasn't been pretty to start the season. This could be a 2-6 football team as much as it can be a 6-2 one. But they just find ways to win in certain situations that make me feel like in games such as this, even as depleted as they are, they should still be considered the favorites. So I feel like the Jets can cover the spread, and I feel like they will. It's going to be a very close game, but I still have the Texans winning it just because of that narrative to them, that cultural kind of moxie that they have compared to what the Jets are right now, that will lead them to victory in this one. Let me know what you think in the comments about this game. Going to be a good one, but coming up on the other side, I'm going to continue talking about Thursday Night Football, but more from a prop bets perspective, which players will step up or step down in tomorrow night's game. We'll be right back to talk about this right after the break. Don't go anywhere.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day here on the show, I do want to remind you yet again that if you wish to interact with the show on a more direct scale, make use of the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. You can do either one of two things. Click that $ in the comment section, leave a tip or donation, or just leave a comment in my comment section that I can read aloud. Get your opinion out there. Just make the show that much better. Just makes me that much more appreciative of all you do for the show and the network especially. Without further ado, let us get into our second segment of the show, continuing this Thursday Night Football narrative, but now from a prop bets perspective, because there are a lot of interesting props that can come about for you tomorrow night. And funnily enough, I want to talk about something that is very rare when I'm taking notes for the show. Usually, I look sometimes very foolish in terms of say, writing something beforehand and having something detrimental to that prediction happen. But, funnily enough, when I was writing down props for Thursday Night Football, I did not even consider Stefon Diggs. So I guess that's a quote-unquote blessing in disguise, because I never want to talk about an injury as a quote-unquote blessing. But it is kind of funny and ironic that in a moment that could have come back to haunt me, I didn't end up choosing a player that got injured. So lucky me for this particular segment. But let's just get right into it. Starting off on the Jets side of things, actually. Let's talk about Aaron Rodgers in this game a little bit. Now, I feel like the best we've seen of Aaron Rodgers this season is when he can control and dictate the tempo of the game. There are moments when, he gets a little bit frustrated in terms of potentially how slow the offense is moving. But when there's a certain tempo, there's a certain intention to the Jets offense, that's when we've seen glimmers and hope of what it could be. And so, in tonight's game, I feel like the same sentiment will carry over to the point where the over on Aaron Rodgers' passing yards, I feel like can hit. So I'm going to take the over for tomorrow night in passing yards as IP14 leaves a comment. Traded DJ Moore for Malik Neighbors, W or L. Now, I feel like this trade is going to be highly dependent on, how both of these respective receiver seasons panned out. Because I feel like Malik Neighbors is still someone who has a lot of upside. I'm not saying, that the overall outlook of the Giants' offense will bring his level of play down. That has to be a consideration. Whereas DJ Moore, week in, week out, I feel like has steadily improved. So, it's going to depend on, how variable the Bears offense looks going forward. If they can get more out of guys like Odunze and Keenan Allen. And then on the Malik Neighbors side of things, it's going to depend on how well the Giants can do in terms of scoring points. If they can find a rhythm in the red zone to score more points for Malik Neighbors. That being said, if I had to look at this from a straight-up trade and not even think about outside factors, I would say it's an L. But the reason why this trade has hope to succeed for both parties is because of the fact Malik Neighbors just has that potential week in, week out. And not for nothing, that could carry the Giants to shock people in certain ways because of the fact he's so good in certain areas of his game that you can't ignore the talent just because he plays for an abysmal offensive team. So that's why I feel like this trade can work out, but on face value, I would say it's looking to be a pretty bad trade. Hopefully this helps in some regard. Good luck to you in your other fantasy football exploits. Let me know if you have any other questions, but thank you for that one, IP14, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this. As IP also says, he felt like he needed the upside. So if it's an upside thing, then I actually think, this can work out for you. But if it was more of, say, a reach, then maybe there was a reason to be skeptical about it. But if you feel like the upside outweighs, the output, then that's your certain feeling and opinions, and I can't really come in between that because, this is a trade between two very good receivers, and they can help you in many different ways. It's just one plays for a hopeful offense and the other plays for one that's not so much very hopeful. So that was just my opinion on that. Going back into my prop bets for this Thursday night football game, I say Aaron Rodgers hits the over because there are going to be some moments where he's going to be in rhythm, he's going to find the receivers he wants, and he's going to get certain big plays on the field. But others where he gets a little impatient, gets a little bit frustrated, he's going to push a little bit too much, and thus the rails could come off in certain moments. Now let's look at the other side of this thing. CJ Stroud. In this game, as IP14 says, I'm a Bears fan and I don't like how the OC using Moore at all. It hasn't really improved much either. To that point, I can see why there are frustrations in terms of the Bears receiver room, But I still think out of all of them, Moore has been one of those players. As IP also said, I think he thinks Rowe might get more involved too. I think out of all those players in that receiver core, DJ Moore has proven the most in terms of getting more touches. 'Cause I feel the same way in a certain regard in that, you still feel like he can do more and mean more in return for this Bears team, but it's at the point where you feel like DJ Moore is just primed for success down the latter stages of the season because of what we've seen these past couple of weeks. In terms of Rome being more involved, I certainly feel like he needs to be, and I feel like in certain moments there are going to be times where he's going to be targeted more often than not, but that is a huge part of his game. Where on the field the Bears are relative to his skill set, if you know what I mean, for Rome. Because he's a very interesting receiver in that he's a solid route runner, but in the red zone especially, he can really help them. So it's going to be interesting to see week in, week out how those targets get meted out in that Bears receiver core. Thank you for your comments. And we'll get back to the topics here. CJ Stroud, I think in this game, it's not always going to be about him. It's not always going to be about, what he does with the football in his hands. So that's why I'm going to take the under here. 1.5 passing touchdowns at minus 234. Just because I feel like this whole season has been defined by the versatility of what the Texans want on the opposite side of football. It's not always going to be about, CJ Stroud having to play hero ball. It's the balance of Joe Mixon. It's a balance now with a more balanced receiving room, but in this case, maybe not so much tomorrow night. But I still think CJ Stroud will affect the game, just not in a way in which his stats will look as lofty as they did last year. So look for him to be functional in this game, but not be the reason the Texans win it. And then let's transition to another Jets prop bet really quickly here before we go into more about what the Texans offense could look like, as they are, in my opinion, the more interesting team to dissect here from a bet perspective. Davante Adams, and then this is a game where, like I said, moments will happen for this Jets offense. And in those moments, Davante Adams will shine because Aaron Rodgers will always look for Davante Adams as his first read, will always look for him as his first target. And so that's why I think he's going to have over 4.5 receptions, at minus 138. And that's, what this Jets offense is going to be predicated on. Because Aaron Rodgers is the one who wanted Davante Adams, so they have to prove that, they can work together in this very volatile Jets team. As IP also says, he likes Brees receptions or receiving yards. I like them too, just because, as IP also says, Jets O-line is going to get crumbled. I do too. I just feel like that's the tenor of this offense, They need to play in tempo, need the run game to get going, or else it falls off the tracks. And so that's why I feel like Davante Adams and Breece Hall are so pivotal, because one of them can get Rodgers going in the pass game, the other keeps him upright. So that's why I feel like those two players are the only two players who I'd be willing to bet money on that their success is integral to the Jets' success in tomorrow night's game. Going over and back to the Texans side of things to conclude this segment, I think the Texans' offensive game plan will be very similar to what the Jets do. I feel like, CJ Stroud is not going to push the ball downfield that much. I feel like, Joe Mixon is a big part of their offense now. And, with the lack of receiving depth now, I feel like, they're not going to be able to sustain a heavy passing game. And so that's why I feel like guys like Joe Mixon and Tank Dell are going to be vital. So I'm going to say Joe Mixon hits the over, 78.5 rush yards at minus 137. And Tank Dell is going to hit the under in 57.5 receiving yards. And now this looks the safest bets because Joe Mixon's role just got more important. Because if he runs the football effectively, that opens up a lot more avenues for the Texans to pick apart what is now becoming a Jets secondary that, while still vaunted, can be scored against. So look for both of these players to mean certain things at certain moments for the Texans in this one. And then, before we go to break real quickly, we want to address one final comment that IP14 just had. Knowing the Jets, they'll probably give Braylon Allen 10-plus carries. I don't necessarily think it'll be the worst thing, because Braylon Allen has proved that he's more than serviceable as a backup to Breece Hall. But there is some truth in stagnation when, the Jets' running game doesn't feel very settled. And so they need to prove that both of these guys can be beneficial to their identity going forward, or else those Braylon Allen touches won't equate to much in terms of what the Jets want to look like in the future. And so that's why I feel like Breece Hall is someone who you need to see have a huge game tomorrow night, and also Devontae Adams, because those feel like the players who you need to invest a lot in going forward if you want to have any success on the offensive side of the football. So I feel like Braylon Allen in this game might not mean as much as people think, but he still is someone to be wary of, because he could be a boom to what the Jets do, or he could be very detrimental. So it's a double-edged sword here, but I'm erring on the side of caution with a guy like Braylon Allen, and most importantly, what he means for the Jets offense. But let me know what you continue to think in the comments about tomorrow night's game. But coming up on the other side, we're going to be concluding our positional rankings for the week, starting off with our tight ends before transitioning to our defenses and special teams units. And this week, the tight ends get a little bit more clear-cut. There's a little bit of sameness to them this week, but there are some guys who I'm kind of taking a flyer on, and you might want to too. So don't go anywhere. Be right back after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And we are now going to be getting into our third segment of the day here on the show. Like I said, concluding our positional rankings, but starting off with our tight ends. Like I said before the break, I feel like the tight end position is getting a little bit more clear-cut week in, week out. We know who thrives in certain situations, and we know who has not risen to the occasion yet this season. However, I still want this to be a very versatile, volatile segment week in, week out, where there's an air of unpredictability to these players that I choose. So, on this list, I do have some players who I feel like have proven themselves as viable fantasy options at the tight end position. But there are some, even though there are only 4, who I feel like you might not have on your radar. And it's all dependent, right, on how integral these tight ends are to their teams. Because that seems to be the story of the season for the position. How important are you to your team to that you're one of the main target men for your particular squad? And so that's what I'm trying to decipher when I make these lists. Without further ado, you have every right to be skeptical. You have every right to appreciate my list. Let's jump right into this list and get a little bit wacky and weird with the tight ends this week. Let's start off with one who is seemingly becoming chalk, though. A guy who, start of the season, really didn't look like he's going to be involved as much in the offense yet again, but has proven his mettle in a very much different, diverse scheme that seems tailored to him and what he can do for this offense. And that is Uber on Graphic, Kyle Pitts, going against the Cowboys. Now, why I like Kyle Pitts in this setup for Atlanta is because of the fact that Kirk Cousins at his best is going to pick apart different secondaries. And the way he does it is that he doesn't go long. He doesn't challenge the corners and safeties. He takes what he gets from the defense. He's very much thriving in short to intermediate areas of the field when he's at his best. And that's where Kyle Pitts makes his money. And so in this game, or in games against certain defenses where you feel like they're not going to load the box trying to pressure Kirk Cousins in the run game, you can definitely get a lot of production out of a guy like Kyle Pitts at the tight end position because he's physical. He can run right past you. You can really challenge your linebackers and corners. And he's not afraid to get physical to win. Excuse me. At the catch point, he's going to be aggressive and he's going to challenge you on every single play. So look for him to continue the solid stretch of form for him. Last week against the Tampa Bay Bucs defense, it's very similar to what the Cowboys are looking like right now. 25.1 fantasy points for him. So look for him to continue to exploit defenses that don't pressure Kirk Cousins. And for that connection to be one that comes in handy from a fantasy perspective. So this is perhaps the most chalk pick you're going to see in my rankings for this week. Now we're going to get a little bit crazy because this next tight end is more so in a team that needs him rather than someone who you rely upon week in, week out. So this one certainly feels like one more so for a fantasy football manager willing to eschew a certain aesthetic of, I need a superstar tight end. Because you're not always going to get superstar tight ends. So you're going to have to look between the margins at certain points. And this guy says between the margins that they get, and potentially in a lower tier than, say, a guy who is looking at a fringe spot on your team. And that is Noah Fant. He's going up against a Rams defense that was going to, as always, try and put pressure on this very weak Seattle O-line. And much like what Kyle Pitts can do for Atlanta, Noah Fant can do for Seattle. He's always kind of like the security blanket player. The past couple of years in this Seattle offense, he has proven to be someone that is vital to their success moving the football. No matter who was the OC, whether it be Waldron, whether it be Grubb right now, Noah Fant's going to be a versatile piece of this offense. He may not always get the football first in certain situations. He may not always be the first look for Geno. But in certain moments, say in third and longs, third and manageables, they roll Geno out. Noah Fant's a huge part of what they do in play action. And look for either one of these Seattle tight ends. I really liked Barner as well to step up against a pass rush that's hungry for more success after perhaps his best performance of the season last week against Minnesota. So look for Noah Fant to try and neutralize those blitzing linebackers, that active front, and really prove his mettle as someone who can be a force to be reckoned with week in, week out in fantasy. For now, let's get back to kind of more chalk. Not necessarily chalk in the sense that this was a guy who everyone was expecting at this point in the season to be one of the best, but someone who's really come into his own when you know the odds are stacked against him and his team, and someone who can continue to do so at a very effective level should you know injury concerns carry over for this team and lead to more missed time for top weapons for them. So Cade Otton, week in, week out, becomes ever more important to what this team does on the offensive side of the football. And not for nothing, this is going to be a very tough matchup for the Bucs, and there's going to have a lot of them coming up. The Chiefs don't allow much, whether it be the run game, whether it be the pass game. They just don't allow much in general. This is a very stingy unit, perhaps the best unit in the entire NFL. And they are the reason why the Chiefs are unbeaten right now. But as far-fetched as it may seem, the Bucs can stay in this one, just because the fact when you look at how this offense sets up, when you look at what Liam Cohen can do to alleviate the burden on some of these players in terms of the outlook of this team without, its stars. I feel like Cade Otton can do a lot of the same things Evans and Godwin were doing, and at an even better scale, even more important scale, because at this moment, if you're the Bucks, you can't panic going forward, because then these teams you're going to play in this difficult stretch will smell blood. And so having a guy like Cade Otton means a lot, because, he may not be, like this elite tight end. He may not be a top 10 guy, but he's someone that can move the ball for you, someone that's comfortable in this offense, and most importantly, someone who Baker trusts even outside of his top guys. So look for Cade Otton to continue making an impact as he always can, because last week he had 29.1 fantasy points versus Atlanta. That's a ridiculous stat for a tight end. Yes, it's a tougher test, but this test is all about, that rapport, that chemistry this Bucks offense is built from top to bottom, and not just within the Chris Godwin and Mike Evans narrative. So look for Cade Otton to continue performing at a very high level for this team. And the last guy that I want to talk about is another guy who you wouldn't anticipate making fantasy football pundits lists. A guy who I was actually impressed with 2 weeks ago as one of Justin Herbert's premier targets in that game against Arizona, but in many ways is someone who can pretend to be frustrating in certain moments in certain games. And so this is one of those guys who I'm kind of nervous about, putting out there on this kind of scale as someone who I feel could start for you this week in fantasy. But I still feel like he warrants attention just because of the outlook of the Chargers offense. Most importantly, how week in, week out, this Chargers offense can develop and grow. And so that's why Will Dissly is always going to be someone who intrigues me. Now, let's go back to that game against Arizona, where I feel like the Chargers did a great job in utilizing a guy like Will Dissly. Will Dissly wasn't doing anything fancy. He was just getting as open as possible on certain routes and really trying to find the soft spots in that Arizona defense. Yes, it didn't equate to any points for his offense, but tight ends who can always exploit the soft spots, whether it be in zone or man, are always going to be vital to their team and to fantasy football managers everywhere, because of the fact that, he may not always be the top target when he's finding these soft spots, but he's still making himself available, making others look better, most importantly, trying to do what is best for his team in certain situations. He's a highly situational guy. He can get it going in the red zone. He can get it going on third and longs, third and manageables. And so that is why his value this season, excuse me, I don't know why I'm yawning so much, stems from success of the Chargers offense as a whole. Because if this Chargers offense really is more of a run-heavy mindset right now, then, the importance of a guy like Will Dissly becomes much more prescient, much more prevalent in how they will play going forward. So if you can get the run game going, chances are that physicality can translate into how your tight end plays. Because the running back and tight end are intrinsically linked in certain teams, to where if the running back performs at a high level, so too can the tight end, because you're opening up certain gaps, keeping defenses on their toes, and also learning to understand your role. And I feel like Will Dissly is understanding that to a T. This veteran of the game is proving that, you don't necessarily have to put up lofty numbers to be respected in the game and respected in terms of this Chargers offense, because he is the X factor for them. If things go awry, who knows? Maybe we'll have to maintain a bigger receiving role in this offense. But until that time, I feel like Will Dissly is someone who will always be effective, no matter how this Chargers offense looks or plans to look going forward, just because of the matchup. And this matchup is an interesting one between him and the Browns, but I feel like, the Browns are a team that can be exploited if, their corners and safeties get caught in an island and Will Dissly's all alone in the middle of the field. So look for him to exploit what the Browns do in terms of their aggressive man-to-man coverage and prove his mettle as someone who could rise quickly in the tight end ranks. But let me know what you guys think in the comments, because the tight end position, I feel like, is becoming a little bit easier to diagnose, but still has room for interesting players to seep their way through the cracks, like a guy like Will Dissly, like a guy like Noah Fant, like a guy like Cade Otton, who, even though I felt like could potentially be a breakout candidate for Tampa, truly now has to be, and is proving to be really quickly. So let me know what you guys think about this in the comments. But coming up on the other side, we officially conclude our positional rankings for Week 9 of the NFL season with the defense and special teams units that I think will best define fantasy football this particular weekend. You don't want to go anywhere. We'll be right back after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available.
Alright guys, hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Sorry about that little mic issue, but we are headed into our fourth segment of the show here, and as always, we have to conclude our positional rankings with our defense and special teams units for the day. The four defenses I have chosen for this particular week are four defenses that, yes, I like the matchups for them, but also have this opportunistic feel to them. Some of them are dominant defenses, at least this season. But most of them, out of the four of them, are defenses that I feel like can take advantage of the errors of opposing offenses, especially opposing offenses like they are facing this week. And so I feel like, this list, as well as my tight end list, was perhaps the toughest to compile this week, just because you never know what defense can surprise you. But in terms of how I view defense, it's a very volatile position that allows for you to interpret it whatever way you want, and that's what I want to do with these rankings. I like to throw in teams that I feel like are matchup-oriented situations, but I also want to throw in teams that, are, like I said, more opportunistic than dominant, because sometimes that matters a lot with fantasy perspective. And it mattered actually to me this past week with the Steelers. They got timely turnovers in important crunch time situations to help me win my fantasy game. So you never really know. Without further ado, let's jump right into my final positional rankings of the week. Starting off with a team that fits more in that opportunistic category than others on this list, the Commanders defense, going up against the Giants. And yes, it was more so a damage control performance against the Chicago Bears, but it proved to me the Washington Commanders are capable of holding offenses to low points totals. And not for nothing, this is a Commanders team that can get driven on. And not for nothing, on the other side of things in this matchup, this is a Giants team that can put together sustained drives. But the key thing to remember here, and the key word in my opinion, is implosion. Because what we saw with the Giants against the Steelers was that in inopportune moments, the Giants offense didn't show up. When they were in the red zone, they turned the ball over, and they did not punch the football in. They did not score points in those situations. And when I look at the Commanders side of things, yes, they're not the best defense. Their secondary is a little skeptical. Their pass rush has been a little bit underwhelming in certain times. At the end of the day, what I love about certain defenses in fantasy is that they can take advantage of the timely errors of others and use it to their advantage. And that seems to be the definition of what the Washington Commanders can do when they're at their best defensively. They can limit the damage, they can get turnovers, and they can turn those turnovers into points. And so I feel like in this game, pretty easy matchup where they have to be wary of the Giants because there are moments where they can get you. I feel like the Commanders can prove that you don't necessarily have to be a dominant defense that doesn't allow X amount of points to be a team that can succeed in a fantasy perspective. So that's why I picked the Commanders. But this could come back to bite me because I could feel like this is a trap game for the Commanders. But who knows? And we'll have to see this Sunday. Then another team that is kind of in both of these categories, dominant and opportunistic, because of the fact that A, nobody expected them to be as dominant as they are this season, and B, they feel like one of those teams that on the defensive side of football are predicated on physicality that could translate to turnovers. Not saying that they always will. Their physicality leads me to believe that this team can be raking in some turnovers in the coming weeks. And against this Colts offense, that yes, with the addition of Joe Flacco looks a bit more promising, but still is a little bit challenged in some areas. I feel like this Vikings defense can't be overlooked. Yes, they've had a little bit of a come down in these past two games where they got kind of beaten up a little bit. But I still have faith in them in certain matchups against these, inferior teams that they can prove their worth as a fantasy defense to be reckoned with. And not for nothing, I do have to consider now this whole Joe Flacco situation, but I think that the reason why I'm still so high on the Vikings defense, even with Joe Flacco, is because Joe Flacco is great in certain areas and terrible in others, and one of them is under pressure. I feel like, this Colts team isn't as well equipped to handle certain moments as that Browns team last year to better protect Joe Flacco. So there will be some moments where he looks a bit shaky. And the Vikings defense are one of those teams that take that into account and take advantage of weakened fronts. And so that's why I feel like Joe Flacco, especially now without, any real semblance of a run game, will be challenged by this Vikings defense, and the reason why I think this Vikings defense will come out on top in that encounter. But let me know what you think about that, because they are a team that can fit any description for what you might want in a fantasy defense. And they've proven that they still have vulnerabilities, they still have flaws, but in certain matchups you can't ignore the fact that Brian Flores' defense, more often than not, has looked one of the best in the NFL. As Splashbro mentions, Minnie has to give us one good result before I'm back in them. Last year they faded late. Flores may be a puzzle good OCs can solve. I feel like, Brian Flores is still someone who has his skepticism. And I feel like a lot of people, still need to see a full season of his success to warrant giving him the plaudits he deserves. But let's be real here. Minnesota didn't have much hope before the season anyways. So, at this point of the season, me saying that they're a defense that, from a fantasy perspective, is sitting in a position where I feel like week in, week out, they can dominate for you, that's something that Vikings fans, I feel, have to take and accept. Yes, right now you're in a weird position, but your schedule, is tough, but you feel like you're going to still be in games. And, that Rams game certainly felt like a trap game. You didn't know Kupp and Nakua were going to come back and play as well as they were. And now you have to go into this Colts game thinking that you're still the team that for the first 6 weeks of the season, really was one of the league's best. And so, for the time being, I'm not ready to write this Vikings team or this defense off just yet. But I do agree with you, Splash Bro, when you say they need to just keep the sacks up, because generating pressure is what this defense does best. And so, if they can't generate consistent pressure, then that's where I feel like trepidation will start to creep in for me, because this Vikings secondary, while I feel like it can get papered over a little bit, can be its most vulnerable unit on the defense. But let me know what you continue to think about Minnesota, because they are going to be a weird team to monitor down the stretch. But going over to a defense that would like to return the favor, so to speak, in this quote-unquote revenge game in the AFC East. The Dolphins defense going up against the Bills after, all the things that happened in the first iteration of this game this season. Now, I feel like the Dolphins defense is one of those defenses that's so middling, yet still has the talent to deliver for you, that you can't really gauge week in, week out what kind of version of the Dolphins defense we're going to get. Because I love the talent they have, I love what they could be, but I can't help ignore the fact that, or I can't help understand the fact that, this team is riddled with injuries on that side of the football. They don't necessarily seem to be stout in one particular department or one particular metric. And, teams feel like they can score on them. We've seen it this season, where they feel like they can pull away, but because of defensive ineptitudes, they just can't seem to pull games out. But this game against the Bills is a nice little proving ground for them that they can stay in games, can stay at the very least in the AFC playoff picture, not necessarily in the AFC East picture. But I do feel like this Dolphins defense has games in them where they prove that they're one of the league's elite. And not for nothing, that ranking, the middle of the pack ranking, does not indicate, troubles or fears about this Dolphins defense. It just indicates that they are more up and down than we expect them to be. And they're volatile. And so that's why I feel like a lot of people might be shying away from them. But this week, look for them to return the favor against a Bills unit that looks like they're on fire, but can be prone to being sprung a surprise. Now, the last team I want to talk about, this one is very much matchups oriented. A defense that could be having its quote-unquote last hurrah here before a lot of these pieces could move around the league, so to speak. The Patriots defense, going up against a very erratic Titans offense, whether Mason Rudolph or Will Levis is leading it. Now, the Patriots defense is a defense that I feel predicates itself on moments. Moments for certain players in certain areas of the game where they can take away what looks like a big play for the opposing team. They can flip the script, so to speak. And yes, I can see why the Patriots could be sellers from this defensive line and from this secondary, but I still feel like their defense needs to keep them in games going forward. And so if pieces such as Devon Godchaux leave, or, someone in their secondary leaves, then it really will be to their detriment. That being said, I feel like in these matchups where you're not necessarily playing an opponent you feel like you should lose against, then why not take a flyer on them? They're a team that still has defensive talent enough to beat up on teams they can beat up on. It's just that, there's not much hope surrounding it when there's talks and rumors rumbling surrounding the fact that a lot of these guys could leave. And so that's why I feel like this whole Patriots defense is up in the air at the moment, and this could be one of those games where they throw caution to the wind and play one of their best defensive games as a unit. So let me know what you think about these four defenses in the comments, because now we're starting to get into pick and choose. It's not going to be defined week in, week out which defense will step up for you. You're going to have to make some difficult decisions. But coming up to conclude today's show, I'll give you my weekly Shatter Report. The key wide receiver cornerback matchups that I feel will define the week in fantasy football. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back to conclude today's show. Hello everyone and welcome back into our final segment of the day here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And as always, we have to conclude our Wednesday show with my weekly Shadow Report. The key wide receiver cornerback matchups that I believe will define the weekend in fantasy football. The 4 matchups are all kind of matchups that are defined by not just one corner in particular, I found this week, but defined by how certain cornerback groups will have to defend certain receivers. There are games this week that really can hinge upon these certain matchups, but still have room to really shock us and surprise us in certain ways. Because one player in one particular matchup can surprise us or the other can. That's what I always try to find in weekly Shadow Reports. So without further ado, let's jump right into my Week 9 version. I'll start off with an interesting one here because it's 2 young guys. Well, we don't know if it's always going to be these 2 who are facing off against each other in this one. Maybe he faces the elder statesman in this one. But 2 young guys who really are quote-unquote foils for each other. Quote-unquote perfect counterparts, so to speak, when I think about young players at both the wide receiver and cornerback position. In this game, I feel like will hinge on this match because the Jaguars are a team that I feel can stick around against teams that, like the Eagles, just try to outscore you in certain points. So look for Brian Thomas Jr. to have an interesting matchup against whoever he faces, Quinyon Mitchell or Darius Slay. And I feel like if he faces Mitchell, it's a very even, intriguing matchup here. Because both of them are solid in areas where they need to be. Quinyon Mitchell, in man-to-man coverage, can lock down any receiver. I feel like he has the ball skills, the hands, the traits to do it. But Brian Thomas Jr.'s verticality is perhaps the best from this wide receiver draft class. His ability to stretch the field, his ability to make contested catches down the field is what can separate him in this matchup. And also the fact that, unlocking that connection between him and Trevor Lawrence could prove to be the most integral in terms of what foundation the Jags want to set on this offense going forward. So look for this matchup, even if he's against Slay, where, Slay is more of the savvy, intelligent guy, but not necessarily someone who can match Thomas in terms of speed and agility. I feel like Brian Thomas will reveal a lot about what the future of this Jags offense looks like if they don't necessarily, win this game, even though I still think it will be close. So look for this matchup to be one that from a fantasy perspective, it can be fun to analyze because it's two young guys, and for as long as both of them are in the league, both of them want to test themselves against perhaps the guy who they best mirror. And so that's why I feel this matchup is interesting any way you slice it, because he could be facing Darius Slay on many snaps in this game. That's how good Brian Thomas is. But it depends on what matchups the Jags want to exploit and how they do it, most importantly, because they can stay in this game. It's just a matter of exploiting the matchups that best bring out Brian Thomas Jr.'s best traits. The second one I want to talk about, Amon-Ra St. Brown in a divisional matchup again against Jair Alexander and Xavier McKinney. Because this matchup is not necessarily going to be predicated on smarts alone. It's going to be predicated on takeaways. Because Amon-Ra St. Brown, what he brings to the table here is the ability to, in certain situations, always get open. He's always going to find a way to make himself available for his offense. And that's going to be tough for two guys who have been exceptional this season, but when I view them from a coverage perspective, I feel like that is where I lose a little bit of respect for them. Because as much as takeaways are an important aspect of what the Packers defense can do, there's going to be some moments where a receiver like Amon-Ra St. Brown comes along and you're going to be forced to defend him on every down in order to completely shut down that aspect of their offense. And let me be clear here. I don't necessarily think Amon-Ra's matchups here will define this game. I think it will define what I feel is a major flaw in philosophies of this Packers secondary. I feel like when you're up against a receiver like Amon-Ra, chances are you aren't necessarily going to always have to think about takeaways. You're going to have to think about, okay, it's second and long, third and long. How do I make sure Amon-Ra St. Brown isn't an option on this play? Because Amon-Ra, no matter whether or not he's getting targeted 3 times or 30 times, will always be someone who is open and will always be a read for Jared Goff, first or second. And so you have to find a way to defend that philosophy rather than think about, okay, when is my next pick going to come? Because that's what I feel like is hindering me from believing wholeheartedly the Packers secondary is one of the elite ones in the NFL outside of their takeaways. So that's why this matchup is more important to me. Not necessarily, from a real-life perspective, from a fantasy perspective. If Amon-Ra starts to get more targets, how this Packer secondary, especially Alexander McKinney, reacts to that. But then the third matchup that I want to discuss is another one of those matchups that's a little bit weird to decipher just because this is a new guy to the Buffalo Bills, finding his footing, going up against a secondary that can be exploited, is prone to giving up the big play, but has weapons in it that we know are elite coverage men. So this match between Amari Cooper and Jalen Ramsey or Kendall Fuller is one that I want to actually see Cooper win. Because if Cooper wins this matchup and the Bills completely annihilate the Dolphins, it proves that the Bills' sentiment in getting Amari Cooper was right. However, the reason why, I'm not fully on the Amari Cooper Buffalo bandwagon is because of the fact that in certain moments he's going to have tougher matchups than, divisional opponents. And this might be the toughest cornerback group out of all the divisional opponents. I know, the Jets have Sauce Gardner and DJ Reed, but they haven't played up to par this season. These two corners for the Dolphins are the guys that I'm looking to see be the true litmus test for Amari Cooper's tenure as a Buffalo Bill. Because if he can beat those two guys, even for as bad as the Dolphins have been, then it proves that in the division, they completely have a stranglehold, but in terms of a playoff run, he can exploit high-level cornerbacks. And so that is why I feel like Amari Cooper's importance in this game extends far beyond fantasy implications as well. It extends to the fact that he needs to prove completely that this trade was worth it. And if he doesn't in this matchup, then I feel like his fantasy output will plummet as well. And his fantasy stock will plummet as a result. So look for this matchup to be very important in terms of defining who Amari Cooper will be on the stretch, not just for the Bills, not just for fantasy, but for the Super Bowl, really. Because this is a Buffalo Bills team that wants to go to the Super Bowl, but they need Amari Cooper to lead them to the promised land and actually justify this trade that they made for him. And then the last one that I want to talk about to conclude today's show is an interesting one as well, because these are, yet again, two very young players here that I feel like will be an underrated matchup to look at. Again, not as big a game as some others here, like, Lions, Packers, Dolphins, Bills, but still one that could be fun and frisky, much like, the Jags and Eagles. That's why I'm picking Marvin Harrison and Jalen Johnson, the last Shatter Report, to update you guys on for this week. Now, this matchup is certainly fun from an aesthetics perspective, because these are two of the most electrifying young players at their respective positions in the league. Marvin Harrison, yes, he runs hot and cold, but that's the beauty of the Arizona offense, because when he's on fire, and he's unstoppable in certain moments. Whereas if you look at Jalen Johnson, he's had some tough opponents. I don't necessarily know who he's faced as that corner there. I'm going to have to look up the Bears' schedule to kind of help me out here. But he has proven his worth as one of the best young corners in the league, going up against someone of his age, someone of his youth. This season, Jalen Johnson has had the pleasure of facing Calvin Ridley and DeAndre Hopkins, Nico Collins and Stephon Diggs, Michael Pittman, Josh Downs, not necessarily, the Rams, when they weren't fully healthy, the Panthers, But this is this first real test, right? This is his first test where it feels like mano a mano. He's facing someone, like I said, of his same age, of his same power, of his same game-changing abilities that can really prove to be a matchup that could define the next decade in the sport. Now, obviously, they're not in the same division, so this doesn't read like a divisional rivalry with much passion as some of the others I mentioned. But I love it because of the fact that these are two young guys who I really like the upside for going at it in a very exciting game. And who knows, both of these teams could project to be playoff teams or playoff contenders on the stretch, and it could be an important one for both of them. So look for this matchup to truly define what it means to be a young player in the NFL, but also someone who could define how you use fantasy for the next 5 to 10 years. But that will just about do it for today's show. Hope you guys enjoyed each and every single segment. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I have been Chris Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. If, as always, you want more content as this or more exclusive short content, consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show on the network on any platform we use, whether it be Instagram, whether it be TikTok, whether it be YouTube. Make yourselves a subscriber to our channel. If you want to interact more directly, as always, be sure to make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Things, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. But other than that, we'll be back tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. Eastern for another great edition of the show. I'm out.